Hi, Modern World History students. So we're continuing with unit number 7, The Rise of Totalitarian Dictators. And this is section number 6, talking about how communism was implemented in the Soviet Union and what the consequences of that implementation were. We already talked about V.I. Lenin's attempt to implement communism and how his initial attempt failed. But then when he revised it through his new economic policy, which introduced some elements that were not true to communism, things turned around and agricultural productivity increased and rebounded. And as a matter of fact, by the time Lenin died in 1924, the agricultural production of the Soviet Union was back to where it had been, in fact, better than where it had been before the outbreak of the First World War. Today, I'm going to have you learn enough, I hope, to be able to explain why and how Joseph Stalin's effort to modernize the Soviet economy via what he called the 5-year plans succeeded, but at great cost, at great human cost to the Soviet people. So in order to help you explain that, you'll learn who Joseph Stalin was, what his 5-year plans were all about. You'll learn about collective farms, and how the way that those were managed led to a famine, another famine in the Soviet Union. But first of all, we need to introduce you a little bit to Stalin himself and how he came to power in the Soviet Union. So since we're still on section 6, we're at the bottom of page 11. So I mentioned that V.I. Lenin had died in 1924 as a result of a second stroke. Stroke is when a blood vessel in your brain hemorrhages. It's also called a cerebral hemorrhage. And Lenin rather, had a stroke earlier in his life that he had left him rather debilitated, and then he had a second stroke in 1924 that killed him. The struggle for power then within the Bolshevik Party really came down to two men. The man on the left, Joseph Stalin, the man on the right, Leon Trotsky. Now, you already know a little bit about Trotsky. He, you may remember, was the commander of the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. And as a result of that, he had, in some sense, a really great resume to make the case that he should take over the leadership of the Bolshevik Party and therefore the leadership of the Soviet Union, remembering that ever since Lenin took over, the Bolshevik Party was the only legal political party in the Soviet Union. So if you're the leader of the party, you're the leader of the country. So Trotsky certainly had a case to make that he deserved to take over, to be Lenin's successor, since he had led the Red Army to victory in the Russian Civil War, defeating the elements of the whites, those who were trying to overthrow the Bolsheviks. Stalin, meanwhile, also had a pretty decent claim to become the new leader of the Bolshevik Party and therefore of the Soviet Union, because after all, it was he who, as Commissar of Nations, had gone out into the different nations that had declared their independence from Russia during the Russian Civil War, and he had actually managed to bring 5 of them back by developing Bolshevik parties in those countries, having them run for positions because these were democracies, having run elections to gain positions in their parliaments, having coordinated also a military effort with the Red Army to support them in countries where they were being resisted, and finally then in winning over Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan to actually rejoin Russia to form the Soviet Union. So both men had a strong resume to make a case that they should be the next leader of the Soviet Union. But Stalin had moved very shrewdly. When V.I. Lenin had his first stroke, he had offered Stalin, or maybe a better way to say it is he had asked Stalin to take over some of his responsibilities within the party. Stalin was a good organizer, and Lenin needed that kind of assistance. And so he had asked Stalin to take over some of his responsibilities. And Stalin had asked to serve as the party's general secretary of the Bolshevik Party. And Lenin had agreed to that. Now, that doesn't sound like a very exciting role, and it wasn't. The general secretary's job was to fill out positions in government where there was someone needed to be employed. So basically giving people jobs. And this was the thing. So in the United States, whoever is the leader of the executive branch appoints people into positions in government. And that was the function of the general secretary within the Bolshevik Party. And that was the job that Stalin took. And it doesn't sound very exciting, but what it did allow Stalin to do is fill up the Bolshevik Party with people who owed him their jobs. And so he filled out the leadership positions in the party with people who were loyal to him. Or you could say the people who received jobs became loyal to him because they owed him their job. And if they wanted to advance to a better job, they would need to stay in his good graces. And so he was able to fill out the positions of the Bolshevik Party leadership with people who would be loyal to him. And so when the time came for a debate within the Bolshevik Party about who should take over and lead the party after Lenin's death, Stalin had a great advantage in that he had filled out the party leadership with people who were loyal to him. And as a result of that, despite the fact that Trotsky certainly had a case that he should be the new leader, Stalin won that debate, and he became the new leader of the Soviet Union. So let's give a little bit of background on him, because we haven't talked a lot about him up till now, only a little bit about him as Commissar of Nations. So Joseph Stalin was actually not Russian. He was not ethnically Russian. He was born in Georgia, so he was ethnically Georgian. And I don't mean Georgia as in the southeastern United States state. I mean Georgia, the republic that is in the southern part of the Soviet Union. Georgia is sort of wedged in between Russia and sort of Iran and Turkey, to give you an idea of where we're talking about, down along the Black Sea. So that's where he was from. And when he was born, his name was Joseph Vissarionovich Dugashvili. So this, by the way, is a very Georgian name. Persons from Georgia are likely to have that ILI ending in their family names. So Joseph Vissarionovich Dugashvili. You can understand why he changed his name. I mentioned to you before that Lenin had changed his name because Lenin's name, Ulyanov, his family name Ulyanov, was not very classic Russian. And that in Russian politics, if you wanted to get anywhere in leadership, you had to have a sort of classic Russian name. Well, Stalin's name was even less classically Russian. It wasn't Russian at all. It was Georgian. And so later on in his career, as he was working his way up in the Bolshevik Party, he changed his name to Stalin, Joseph Stalin, which in Russian literally means man of steel, which is a pretty robust name. Right? That's a name for a guy who is trying to ascend to great political power. Joseph Stalin, man of steel. As a young man, you see on the left, Stalin as a young man, he was a criminal. I mean, he was a thief and a sort of a gangster. He was imprisoned many, many times. Within that sort of underworld, that criminal underworld, he became familiar with and associated with a lot of political radicals. And that's how he became a radical. You might remember that Lenin was not a radical as a young man and became a radical when his brother was murdered by the Tsar's secret police. Stalin was not a radical, but he was a criminal. And in his imprisonments, he came into contact with people who were radicals because, of course, in Russia, you also got imprisoned for having radical political ideas. And that's how Stalin was exposed to radical political ideas. And soon, he was not just a criminal, but a radical as well. And he was imprisoned multiple times, not simply for his criminal behavior, but for his radical beliefs. And he escaped. He escaped 5 times from the Tsar's prisons, which caused a lot of his prisoners to wonder if he was some kind of double agent who was being allowed to escape. But it doesn't seem to be the case at all. He was not a double agent who was escaping only to report on the criminals and then be put back in jail. He seemed to have been very, very good at escaping from these prisons, and it seems the Tsar's prisons were also just not very secure, because Stalin, when he later became the leader of the Soviet Union, was determined to create an improved prison system that would not be easy, that would essentially be impossible for prisoners to escape from. So it seems that his own escapes were actually not secretly releases to allow him to go and report on the behavior of prisoners, his fellow prisoners, but that he actually legitimately escaped from the Tsar's prisons 5 times. He was determined not to let that happen when he became the leader. He was an extremely distant person, a person who did not form loving relationships with other people. And as a matter of fact, he seemed to be almost completely insensitive to the suffering of other people. In a way, that is one of the defining characteristics of a psychopath, a person who seems to have no concern, no care, no sympathy for the suffering of others. As I mentioned, he didn't form relationships well. He got married and he had children, but ultimately his wife committed suicide. And I think that's probably an indicator of the nature of his relationship with her, that she found herself in a position where she didn't want to go on any longer and she committed suicide. Stalin did not attend the funeral. So to give you a sense of how that worked out, his daughter, Svetlana, ultimately served him almost like a domestic servant, almost like a maid and a cook and a gardener sort of all wrapped into one. When she fell in love with an officer in the Russian army, he redeployed the officer hundreds of miles away so that her relationship with him could not develop. And he didn't intend for her to marry and go off and leave him. He intended to sort of keep her around as this sort of domestic servant. His son, Jacob, did attempt suicide. He put a gun to his chest and pulled the trigger. He did not succeed in killing himself. He succeeded in wounding himself very, very badly and had a months-long recovery in a hospital. And during that months-long recovery, Stalin only visited him 1 time. And according to a nurse who was present in the room when Stalin entered the room, he walked in, Stalin did, looked at his son who was lying there in extreme pain, and he simply pointed at him and said, "Ha, you missed." So this is a guy who seems to have no capacity for sympathizing with other people or for understanding their suffering. And that perhaps helps us to understand his behavior as the leader of the Soviet Union, because in the end, he made decisions that led to massive human suffering, widespread human suffering amongst his own people. And it seems that he was completely insensitive to that. It seems that he was completely comfortable making those kinds of decisions and sort of dismissing the consequences of those decisions. He simply didn't care for people that much. He tended to sleep during the day and work during the night so that he didn't have to interact with people very much. Even though he was the leader of one of the most powerful countries in the world, he lived in a very small, basic apartment with some very meager furnishings so that he wouldn't be expected to host people and entertain people. He just seemed to be a person who was not connected to other people. And that certainly contributed to the kinds of decisions that he made as the leader of the Soviet Union. So having given you a little sense of his personal background and character, let's move on to how Stalin implemented communism in the Soviet Union. And so I'm moving you to the bottom now of page 12. So Joseph Stalin believed that the Soviet economy needed to modernize, and needed to modernize very, very rapidly. When Stalin took over as the leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin died, Stalin said, "We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag," which is to say, we must close this gap within 10 years, or else we shall be crushed. So this was Stalin. Those were his words. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must close this gap in 10 years, or else we shall be crushed. Was he right that the Soviet Union was 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries? Yeah, he was right. As we've mentioned before, Russia during World War I was essentially a feudal society with an economy that was entirely based on farming. Russia had not really developed, despite the efforts of guys like Tsar Peter the Great back in the 1700s. Russia had really not developed into a trade-based, certainly not a manufacturing-based economy, the way that the Western European countries had, the way that Britain had, the way that France had, the way that Germany had, the way that Italy had, the way that the United States had. And so as of 1924, when Stalin took over, that was still largely the situation. Again, there were factories in some of the major cities, but the Soviet economy remained not unmodernized and not manufacturing based. And so when Stalin then said, we have to close this gap in 10 years or we'll be crushed, he was essentially seeing into the future. Stalin seems to have understood, perhaps better than anyone else in 1924, that a second world war was coming, that there would be a second massive war between the countries of Europe, perhaps spreading around the world, and that in this war, if the Soviet Union had not caught up with the other advanced countries, the Soviet Union would not survive. I mean, Russia had essentially not survived the First World War. They had been invaded by Germany, and the pressures caused by that invasion had led to the downfall of Russia's government twice. First the Tsar, then the provisional government. And so Stalin's view was that if the Soviet Union did not modernize its economy and do it quickly, within 10 years, and he's saying this in 1924. Now, as it turns out, he had a little more time than that. The Second World War in Europe did not break out until 1939. The Soviet Union was not invaded until 1941. But basically, he laid out the timeline. We've got to close the gap between us and the advanced countries in these next 10 years, or in the next war, which is coming, we'll be crushed. So he implemented what was called a 5-year plan. A 5-year plan. And actually, there were multiple 5-year plans. There was a first 5-year plan, and then when that 5-year period was over, a second 5-year plan, and so on. And the idea of these 5-year plans was that Stalin set ambitious goals for the modernization of the Soviet economy. He set ambitious goals for the increase in the Soviet Union's production of manufactured goods. And these goals were sort of staggered in 1-year chunks. And then at the end of the 5-year period, there was a final goal that the Soviet Union was supposed to reach in terms of the increase of its productivity and manufacturing. And Stalin said, if any of these goals are to be achieved, if we are going to modernize this economy rapidly, we're going to have to make sacrifices, and we're going to have to focus on the basics. So think about it. What are the basics? What are the fundamentals of a modern manufacturing-based economy? Take about 5 seconds and think about what are the things that you have to produce if you're going to have a modern manufacturing-based economy. Well, let's start with Stalin's new name, steel. Remember, steel is the basic building block of all modern manufacturing-based economies. Steel is what machines are made out of. It's what railroads, the rails and the locomotives and the rail cars are made out of, the wheels on the rail cars, and think parts made out of steel. Boilers for steam engines are made out of steel. The frames of skyscrapers are made out of steel. It's all made out of steel. And of course, weapons too are made out of steel. And so that's the basic building block. So he said, we've got to focus on steel production. Also, production of electrical power. And by the 20th century, electrical power was one of the major forms of power for factories and for societies. So in addition to producing steel, we've got to focus on producing electrical power. Heavy machinery. So the production of the machines that help make the parts for other machines. Production of tractors. Large-scale machinery that is used to produce other things. Those are the kinds of things that have to be a focus of Soviet manufacturing. So we're going to focus on the basics. Now, what did that mean for the Russian people, for the Soviet people? It meant that Russia or the Soviet Union's economy was not going to be built around the production of what we call consumer goods, things that people use in their houses. So in the United States in the 1920s, our factories had moved on from the basics. In the United States, our factories were cranking out things like vacuum cleaners and radios and washing machines and Model T Fords for people to drive around. What Stalin was saying to the Soviet people is, that's not us. And that's going to be a sacrifice that the Soviet people are going to have to make in order to achieve this rapid modernization. The Soviet people are not going to have the same quality of life and should not expect the same quality of life as people in the United States or Germany or Britain or France, which have had modern manufacturing-based economies for 50 to 100 years already. Those kinds of things, those consumer goods which are being produced in Western Europe and in the US, those are not going to be available to the Soviet people. We have to focus on the basics: steel production, electrical power production, heavy machinery production. So that was going to be the focus of the modernization of the Soviet economy, at least for the first 5 years, and probably for the second 5 years as well. And he had ambitious goals for increasing steel production, increasing electrical power production, increasing the extraction of oil, and of course, heavy machinery production. So very ambitious goals. Now the problem was, how do you fund all of this? Because remember, when we did industrialization, we talked about how one of the necessary factors before a country can become industrialized is capital. And so the question is, where was the capital going to come from? Where was the money going to come from to build all these factories and build all the machines for the factories and to extract the natural resources like the electrical or like the oil and the coal and things like that? A lot of money was going to be needed. A lot of capital was going to be needed. And so Stalin said, there's another 5-year plan poster. Stalin said, we are going to get it out of the one area of the Soviet economy that is already very functional, and that is agriculture. So I'm now going to move you to the top of page 13 to talk about how Stalin sort of reshaped agriculture in the Soviet Union. Stalin said, there's one sector of our economy that is already very, very effective, very functional, very productive, and that is agriculture, farming. And he was right. Remember that in the last years of Lenin's leadership, after Lenin introduced the NEP, the new economic policy, Soviet agriculture had rebounded fully from its lows. Soviet agriculture had dropped, or Russian agricultural production had dropped during the First World War due to so many peasants being drafted into the army. It had dropped again as a result of Lenin's famine. But as a result of the NEP, it had rebounded. It had come all the way back, and actually Russian or Soviet farmers were producing even more than they had prior to the First World War. So Stalin said, that's where we will get our capital, the capital that we need to build our factories. Okay, that's true. Also, the Soviet Union had going for it some of the best farmland in Europe, by the way. Western Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, some of the best farmland. But what Stalin said is, although we're doing very well, we can do even better. And the reason we can do even better is that right now, the techniques and technologies used by Russian farmers are very outdated, old techniques. So, most Russian farmers were peasant farmers. They had a small portion of land. During Lenin's time, All of the land had been taken away from the nobles, and it had been redistributed to the peasants. And so each peasant family had their own little tiny portion of land that they were farming. And as a result of that, they farmed using old techniques, inefficient techniques. Basically, they were farming by hand. They were farming using the same techniques and technologies that had been used in Russia for hundreds of years. So they weren't using modern farming techniques or modern farming technologies. It didn't make sense. You couldn't, and there was no way for the Soviet Union to give them modern farming technologies. If you were to try to provide every peasant family with a tractor and harvesters like you see here in this poster, if you were to try to provide one of those to every peasant family, number one, the Soviet Union couldn't produce that many tractors. And number two, they wouldn't be used effectively. They would, if you gave a tractor and a harvester to every family, every peasant family, even if you could produce them, the amount of land that each family had was so small that they would only use their tractor 1 day out of the year or 2 days out of the year. And what was the point of that? So Stalin said we have to reorganize farming in the Soviet Union. And he did. He created what were called collective farms. Collective farms. So what he would do is he would take like 100 small peasant farms and combine them into one giant farm. And so, the Soviet Union, prior to Stalin implementing collective farming, there were some 20 million small peasant farms in the Soviet Union. By the time Stalin was done, he had reduced that to 200,000 farms, each of which was very, very large and had lots of peasants available to provide labor. So they went from having 20 million tiny little peasant farms to 200,000 giant farms with 100 peasant families working on them. Now that allowed him to provide them with the modern technologies. He might not be able to, Soviet factories might not be able to produce enough tractors to give 20 million peasant farmers their own tractor. Couldn't do that. That was an impossibility. But they could produce 400,000 tractors, 600,000 tractors, 1 million tractors, so that each giant farm had 5, let's say. If they produce 1 million tractors, then each of these giant collective farms would have 5 tractors that they could use to help them. And so that's what he was doing. That would actually provide a much more efficient use of the tractors, of the technology, because now with a large farm, you would actually use them many, many days out of the year. So collective farming was meant to help increase the productivity of Soviet farmers. Instead of having tiny little peasant farms being farmed using literally ancient techniques and technologies, hand plows and things like that, you would have these 200,000 giant farms using modern techniques, modern technologies to increase their productivity. And he was probably right about that. Introducing these new technologies and increasing the efficiency undoubtedly would have increased the productivity of Soviet agriculture. But there was something else that he intended to do, which sabotaged the whole thing. When the peasants of a collective farm completed the harvest, right? When all the crops had grown and all the crops had been harvested, Stalin then took all of the crops, set aside a portion of those crops to sell to other countries, right? And then gave the Soviet people, their little equal shares so that they could survive and keep their families alive. The whole idea of taking a portion of the productivity and selling it to other countries, that's how Stalin was going to raise money to pay for the building of factories. See, that's what he said. We need capital. We need money to build our factories. Where do we get it? Oh, we get it out of the one sector of our economy that is already productive, agriculture. What we're going to do is we're going to increase the efficiency of our agriculture. We're going to produce more crops. And of course, there were goals in the 5-year plans for how many crops would be produced. And we're going to take some of those crops and we're going to sell it. And he had goals for how much crops needed to be sold. We're going to sell it to other countries. So this, unfortunately, what this meant, though, was that the secret sauce that had made Lenin's new economic policy work and had allowed for the rebound of agricultural productivity in the Soviet Union was now taken away. Remember, under Lenin's new economic policy, each Soviet peasant was given a quota for how much grain they needed to produce. If they produced a surplus, if they produced more than that amount, they could keep it and either sell it themselves or keep it for their family to have more grain, more food than what their quota allowed. Okay? That provided an incentive to produce more, because if you produced more, you got to keep it. Stalin now eliminated that incentive because he said, no matter how much the big collective farms produce, we are taking all of it. We will distribute equal amounts to all the Soviet people so that they have enough food to eat, but we're going to take the surplus, we're going to take the rest of it, and we're going to sell it to other countries to make money to build our factories. Now, again, it's a perfectly good plan, but by doing that, it once again took away all of the peasants' incentive to be more productive. With Lenin, they had that incentive. If you were extra productive, if you produced a surplus, if you produced more than you were expected, you got to keep it. But under Stalin's collective farming plan, you didn't. All of the production was taken away, and a portion of it was sold to other countries to make money to build factories. Well, of course, this led to a collapse in productivity again. When peasants realized that they had no incentive to produce more than just what the very basics, they stopped doing it. They stopped producing more. And again, when they realized that they would receive an equal share of grain, no matter whether they were very productive or not very productive, they became not very productive. They stopped producing because, as they perceived it, whether they produced a lot or a little, they were still going to receive that same share. And whether they produced a lot or a little, they weren't going to get to keep any surplus for themselves, any extra for themselves anymore. That incentive was gone. And so, although the increased efficiency and the new technology should have allowed Soviet agriculture to increase and really grow the way that Stalin had planned, that's not what happened. And instead, you had another famine. This one was called Stalin's famine. And what made it worse was, even though Soviet agricultural production did not grow the way that Stalin expected, even though that it did not grow according to the goals of the 5-year plan, Stalin still took the portion of Soviet crops, Soviet harvest, that he intended to sell to other countries and sold it. Even as his own people starved, even as there was not enough food to feed the Soviet people and keep them alive, Stalin said, nope, the plan says we have to sell this much to foreign countries each year in order to make the money we need to open our factories, and we are going to sell this much, regardless of what's happening to my own people. And that, of course, just made the famine more devastating, worse. Lenin's famine had killed 10 million people. Stalin's famine killed certainly 15 million people. Now, it wasn't just those 15 million people who died during Stalin's famine that were the human cost of Stalin's leadership. Stalin did not tolerate dissent or criticism of any kind. And so in section 7, a shorter section, we're going to talk about how Stalin responded to people who disagreed with him or criticized his policies. And we'll learn all of those items on the right: kulaks, gulags, forced famine in the Ukraine, and something called the Great Purge. So we're now moving to the bottom of page 13 to talk about how Stalin dealt with people who disagreed. Well, first of all, there was resentment. There was resentment by the peasants who were being forced to give up their crops. I mean, as you can imagine, in the years under the new economic policy, remember, they had been allowed to keep any surplus. Now, if they produced a surplus under the 5-year plans, it was taken from them. And so many peasants simply resisted. They refused to hand over their surplus. Instead, they tried to hide it. They would try to hide the surplus. When the government came around to collect the harvest, when the government came around to collect the crops, the peasants would try to prevent the government from finding the crops. They would hide it, they would hoard it, they would sort of squirrel it away somewhere so they could keep it for themselves. When the government realized this was happening, they became much more aggressive about searching the properties or searching the farms where the peasants were doing the farming. And peasants who were found to be hiding or hoarding grain were then arrested. There was a name for peasants who did that. Peasants who refused to hand over their grain became known as kulaks. Kulaks, which in Russian translation means greedy peasants. It actually is a little nastier than that, but basically the key word there is greedy. Greedy peasants. So peasants who refused to hand over their grain production to the government, who tried to hide their surplus, who tried to prevent the government from confiscating their surplus, were referred to as kulaks. And they were arrested and sent to prison camps. These prison camps were called gulags. So they sent the kulaks to the gulags. Gulags were prison camps out in the most remote part of Russia, which is called Siberia. Siberia, if you look at a map, is the northernmost tier of Russia. It is in an area of Russia where there's what's called permafrost. Permafrost, meaning that the soil is permanently frozen, that even in the spring and summer when the air temperatures begin to warm up, the deep freeze of the winter has been so complete and has penetrated the soil so deeply that the soil remains frozen even during the spring and summer months, which are not all that warm either. So this is how Stalin solved this problem of, how do I build prisons so that no one can escape them? Instead of having traditional prisons, he built these prison camps called gulags. He located them in the middle of Siberia so that even if someone escaped from the camp itself, they would never stand a chance of making it back to civilization, all right? They would never stand a chance to making it back to their homes alive. They would die in the wilderness of Siberia, which was abandoned and freezing cold. And the gulags were labor camps. And so when a person was sent to the gulag, what that meant was that they were sentenced to do hard labor. They were often closely associated with coal mines or iron mines or forests, where trees were being cut down for wood. Sometimes there were small factories. But Stalin's idea was that you're going to die in the gulag, okay? You're never going to come back from the gulag. Once you are sent to the gulag, you will never return. But in the meantime, we are going to extract as much labor from you as we possibly can. And so when a person was sent into a gulag, they would be provided with inadequate shelter, inadequate clothing, inadequate food, inadequate medical care, but just enough to give them the energy to do the work that they were supposed to do. And they would essentially be worked then to exhaustion, worked to death. That was what happened to you in a gulag. And the life expectancy of a person entering the gulag was about 6 months. The likelihood is that you wouldn't live much more than 6 months once you entered a gulag. So peasants who were identified as kulaks, greedy peasants, who refused to hand over their grain harvest to the government, were arrested and sent into the gulags, where millions of them died, after 6, 8, whatever months of inadequate living conditions and very difficult, backbreaking, exhausting labor. The gulags literally were home to millions of prisoners, millions and millions. Perhaps 10 to 20 million people died in the gulags during Stalin's time as the leader of the Soviet Union. He led the Soviet Union from 1924 until 1953. So a period of 29 years, he led the Soviet Union. And during that time, 10 to 20 million people died in the gulags. There was a point where the gulags, if you treated them as an employer, like a company, they were the Soviet Union's largest employer. They had more people working for them than any other division of the Soviet government. Meanwhile, what about people working in the factories? How were they kept productive? Because again, no matter what you did, if you worked in the factories, no matter whether you were very productive or not very productive, you were sort of entitled to this basic standard of living that communism promised everyone because of its commitment to equality. So how did you motivate factory workers to be productive, to keep their quotas or even exceed their quotas? Well, factory workers who were exceptionally productive, who exceeded their quotas, were eligible to receive an award called the Red Banner of Labor. And factory managers whose factories overall exceeded their production quotas received special awards, even more prestigious awards. But the award you see on the left is the Red Banner of Labor, which was awarded to workers who were especially productive, who exceeded their production quotas. As it turns out, this was insufficient, though. And so in addition to this sort of award that was given to highly productive workers, there was the fear of punishment that was also present. Stalin's secret police, who were called the NKVD, you don't need to know that. They were Stalin's secret police. They replaced Lenin's Cheka. They would make surprise inspections of factories. And when the secret police arrived at the factory, they would say to the factory manager, "Bring me your least productive worker." And the manager would be required to identify a worker who was considered the least productive. And they would shoot that person. They would execute that person right in front of the other workers. And they would say, "See you again next time." And that was how Stalin motivated factory workers. So peasants who did not produce their quota and handed over to the government were sent to the gulags. Factory workers who didn't produce their quota might be identified as the least productive worker and shot to death by the secret police when they made their inspections of the factories. And again, it's unknown how many hundreds of thousands of factory workers died this way, but they served as a sort of warning. It was a motivation of fear to keep the factory workers productive. There was one group of people who very, very actively resisted Stalin, particularly in his collective farming scheme. That is the people of the Ukraine. The Ukraine, as I mentioned, is some of the finest farmland in all of Europe. And the Ukrainians are ethnically different from the Russians. The Ukrainians speak their own language. Many Ukrainians resented its government deciding to rejoin with Russia to form the Soviet Union. And so when Stalin implemented his collective farming plan, farmers in the Ukraine rebelled. In part, this was a nationalist rebellion because Ukrainians were unhappy being told what to do by Russians. But in part, it was also a rebellion against the destruction of their traditional way of farming. Ukrainians had farmed in small family farms for hundreds of years using their traditional techniques. When Stalin tried to force their small family farms into these giant collective farms with new techniques and technologies, they didn't like it, and so they did rebel. Stalin then sent the army of the Soviet Union into the Ukraine to extract all of their grain and force a famine in the Ukraine. So in addition to Stalin's famine, which was going on throughout the Soviet Union and was simply a result of his policies, his collective farming policies, Stalin deliberately starved the people of the Ukraine to death. It was a genocide. It was an attempted genocide by Stalin by denying the people of the Ukraine adequate food, by sending in the army to extract their food so they didn't have enough. It was a deliberate attempt to starve the people of the Ukraine to death, and it very nearly succeeded. 7 million Ukrainians died as a result of Stalin's deliberate forced famine, which was his punishment toward them for resisting his collective farming policy. And there was what was called the Great Purge. And I see that I've covered up the word great with my picture. I apologize. Stalin, as I said, did not tolerate any dissent. Anyone who disagreed with him, anyone who criticized him, he had no toleration for that. And so he ordered the execution, or people who disagreed with him or criticized him disappeared into the gulags. And this was called the Great Purge, the purge of anyone who he saw as a rival, anyone whom he saw as a critic. These people were to be purged, put on trial, and either executed or sent to the gulags. Even Leon Trotsky, who had been his rival for leadership of the Bolshevik Party, was purged, murdered by Stalin's secret police. And again, it's not clear how many people died during the Great Purge, probably in the hundreds of thousands, but they were just added to the death toll of people killed, either as a result of Stalin's policies or deliberately at Stalin's order. So how many were killed during Stalin's 29 years as leader of the Soviet Union? Perhaps around 50 million people. I mean, you start doing the math, 15 million people in his famine, 10 to 20 million people in the gulags, 7 million people in the Ukraine, hundreds of thousands murdered in the factories, hundreds of thousands in the purges. The number sometimes is suggested to be as high as 50 million people. Now, if you confronted Joseph Stalin with this and said, look, during your leadership of the Soviet Union, 50 million people died, 30, 40, 50 million people died, Stalin would say to you, that's exactly right, but it's completely irrelevant. Look at what I accomplished. So here is the growth of coal production in the Soviet Union in between the beginning of the 5-year plans and the German invasion. Look how much coal production increased. Look how much steel production increased. Look how much oil production increased. Look how much electrical power production increased. The Soviet Union went from being the 16th largest manufacturing country in the world, that is producing the 16th largest amount of manufactured goods per year, when Stalin took over, to being second in the world, behind only the United States by the time World War II began. So remember what Stalin had said. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must close this gap in 10 years, or at the very least, we must close this gap before the next world war happens, or else we shall be crushed. And Stalin would say, yes, tens of millions of people died on my watch, my own people, but look what I accomplished. I increased the production of coal, steel, oil, electrical power. I increased the manufacturing productivity of the Soviet Union. We went from 16th in the world to second. And when World War II came and when the German invasion came, the Soviet Union was ready. So you have to kind of evaluate Stalin in that way. You have to look at the horrible, catastrophic human suffering that resulted from his policies and his deliberate efforts to eliminate people who disagreed with him. But he would say to you, but you also have to balance that against what I accomplished in terms of the rapid modernization of the Soviet economy and the readiness of the Soviet Union to fight the Second World War when it finally came. All right, so that's it for this lesson. In our next lesson, we will move on to Italy and Benito Mussolini. So until then, take care of yourselves, stay healthy and safe. Bye-bye, everybody.